I'd like to welcome Aaron Caplan and our viewers to the first interview in our new series called Talking with the Authors. All of the guests on this program have written articles that were published in the Journal of Educational Controversy, and we hope to have this as a regular feature of our journal. My name is Aaron Caplan, and I'm the editor of the Journal of Educational Controversy at Western Washington University. Aaron Caplan's article, Visions of Public Education in Morse v. Frederick, appeared in our winter 2008 issue that focused on the topic, Schooling as if Democracy Matters. The case, Morse v. Frederick, was the first student free speech rights case to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in almost 20 years. The decision came down last spring, and the ACLU was involved in the case. Our guest today, Aaron Caplan, is a staff attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington State. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Michigan Law School, and clerked for Judge Betty Fletcher of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He has been working with the ACLU since June 1998, and beginning in the fall of 2008, Aaron will join the faculty of Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, where he will be teaching constitutional law and civil procedure. And we're lucky to have you before you leave for California.
Thank you. I'm lucky to be here.
So I'd like to welcome you, Aaron, as our first guest. I will be joined today in this interview with 4 faculty and 2 graduate students at Western Washington University, and they will be able to ask questions from their own unique perspectives. So I'd like to have them introduce themselves and perhaps tell us what perspective you will be coming from.
I'm John Richardson. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology. My long-term interest has been in the history and sociology of education, so I guess you'd say that my perspective, I'd like to say, is from historical fact and sociological comprehension.
My name is Bruce Larson. I'm in the Department of Secondary Education, and we work to prepare people to go out and teach in middle schools and high schools. And my area of emphasis is in social studies education, and specifically about discussing public issues and controversial issues in the classroom.
I'm Mary Lynn Darrington. I'm on faculty in the educational administration programs. We prepare principals and superintendents in our programs. I'm a former superintendent for 18 years and a principal before that, and so my perspective is the role of the administrator in matters involving the law.
My name is Daniel Larner. I'm a professor of theater at Fairhaven College at Western, where I also teach a course in civil rights and liberties. I'm a 30-year board member of the American Civil Liberties Union of Washington.
My name is Jessica Scheinbaum. I'm a student in the Master's in Teaching program at Western Washington University, and I'm seeking an endorsement in visual art and ESL, and I'm interested in bringing issues of social justice into the classroom.
My name is Hillary Hall. I'm also a student in the Master's in Teaching program, and I hope to teach French.
Well, I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today. And Aaron, I thought perhaps we could start by having you describe what Morse v. Frederick was all about and why it was so important that the ACLU took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The case itself seems like a rather insignificant case as far as school cases is concerned, and I'm wondering why the Supreme Court would even want to take the case and make law out of it.
Right. Well, Morse v. Frederick is certainly an interesting case. It is sort of unusual, the precise facts of it, and I don't know how often it's going to come up again. But what happened was there was a high school in Juneau, Alaska, that was on the route of the Olympic torch in 2002. And so the school decided that if teachers wanted to release their classes to go watch the torch run by the front of the high school, they could do that. And that was probably a wise educational decision, because otherwise the students would all be looking out the window anyway. So they might as well make sort of a field trip out of it. There was a student at the school named Joe Frederick, and he was sort of an iconoclastic fellow. And he and his friends decided that it would be fun to do something when the torch ran by that would be sort of exciting and different and a little bit controversial, and see if they could get on TV that night. So they made a banner, a big banner. It's like 20 feet long, 5 or 6 feet tall. And they put this slogan on it that said, "Bong Hits for Jesus." And again, when Mr. Frederick was asked, well, what does this mean? He said, well, it sort of means what you want it to mean. It's supposed to be a little edgy, a little controversial, but he didn't have a specific meaning behind it. It was just something that was supposed to be a little bit funny and a little bit weird. So the school was, students were released to be watching the relay race go by with the torch, and then when the cameras were near them, they unfurled their banner that said "Bong Hits for Jesus." The principal didn't like the banner at all. She actually came across the street and told them to put it down, and when they didn't put it down fast enough, she actually tore it out of their hands and wadded it up and told Joe Frederick, "You're reporting to the principal's office." So he got to the principal's office. She said, "This was unacceptable behavior. You're being suspended for 5 days." At which point he said, "Well, Thomas Jefferson said we founded this country to have freedom of speech. Would you kick Thomas Jefferson out for 5 days?" At which point the principal said, "You're suspended for 10 days for talking back." So that's sort of the facts. It's a little unusual in that you have this question about, well, gee, is a field trip the same as what happens in school? But basically it was a case of discipline for the class clown. Now, why would the ACLU be interested in this? If the school had handled this differently, or if the school's lawyers had handled this differently, maybe it would not have been a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. But what happened very quickly is the school took a pretty aggressive legal position, which was anytime students say something that contradicts what we teach at school, we get to punish them. So the school said, we are trying to teach that recreational drug use is a bad thing. It's against the law, it's bad for your health, and this banner, "Bong Hits for Jesus," it seems to imply that maybe drug use is not such a bad thing, and we can't have students publicly disagreeing with what the school says, and that's why we're punishing you. Now that is a really extreme position in our view. You know, obviously it's good for schools to teach the things that the school administration believes in. It's perfectly appropriate to have drug education so that students know about drugs and what's right with them or what's wrong with them. But to say that not only must students listen to what we're teaching, the students are not ever allowed to contradict us, that is a really, I believe, scary prospect for a school in a democracy. You know, students, obviously they need to understand what's being taught to them. They'll be tested on it. But if they choose to disagree with it, they should have a right to disagree. But the school was taking this position that said, no, students are not allowed to disagree. If they had just disciplined Joe Frederick for misbehaving during a field trip, the case probably wouldn't have gone where it did.
Aaron, the Morse v. Frederick case, which was decided last spring, is just one of a number of cases that the Supreme Court decided that dealt with free speech issues of students in public schools. Ever since the Tinker case, I think it was back in 1969, where the court established constitutional rights for students in public schools, there have been several other cases as well. I was wondering if you could share with our viewers where Morse v. Frederick fits in the whole history of speech rights cases that were decided by the Supreme Court.
Right. There's always been sort of two tides of cases where courts have been asked to look at school discipline decisions involving student speech. What most of them recognize is two basic ideas. First of all, that public schools are part of the government, and so they have to respect the constitutional right of free speech. So there were some people earlier on in the 20th century who were suggesting that, hey, students don't have any rights to free speech at school. The First Amendment doesn't have anything to do with it. It is purely beyond the scope of the Constitution. Well, all of the modern U.S. Supreme Court cases disagree with that. Students, just like everyone else, have a right to free speech. Now, the question is your right to free speech inside the school the same as your right to free speech when you're just going about your business on the street or on the sidewalk? And the cases have always recognized that it needs to be a little different in a school context. I mean, if you're in math class and the teacher asks you to do an algebra problem and instead you start talking about the movie that you saw over the weekend, it's not accomplishing the educational purpose. So there needs to be some ability to control student speech. But that control needs to be for legitimate educational purposes. So one of the big cases that you mentioned was Tinker versus Des Moines School District in 1969. In that one, there were students who were protesting against the Vietnam War. So they wore black armbands to protest the war. The school didn't like it. They said, oh, it's just controversial. Students will get into arguments about the war. We'd rather they were thinking about math and English. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, look, these armbands aren't causing any real problem. The students might be talking about things in the hallway that are not your choice of what they would be talking about, but it's not really disrupting the class day. Students are citizens who are allowed to talk about subjects of their choice. So unless their speech is something that is actually disruptive, you shouldn't punish them for it. So that's one major principle. Now, Morse v. Frederick, I think, deviated from Tinker, very explicitly so. It said, disruption is not the only thing that can be a basis for punishment. And in Morse v. Frederick, what the majority of the Supreme Court said is, if a student is advocating in favor of using illegal drugs, the school can punish them, period. And you say, well, why single that out? Why is that one thing you can punish whether it's disruptive or not? Well, I don't feel as if the Supreme Court really explained itself, at least not to my satisfaction. They just sort of said, drugs are bad, speech in favor of bad things is bad, therefore the school can punish them. But unlike the Tinker case, which set out some principles, that apply to a whole bunch of different settings, this recent case, Morse, it just said, well, today we're deciding that drugs are bad, and tomorrow we might decide something else is bad too. We'll let you know.
Justice Alito didn't want this case to have implications for, broader implications, I believe. And, for example, it didn't mean that students couldn't talk about the war on drugs or that students couldn't, discuss issues. I'm just wondering, though, what does it mean to promote drugs? Why was that banner seen as a promotion of drugs?
Well, that's a great question. And it was one of the things that was a point of difference in some of the opinions that different justices wrote. Justice Stevens, for example, he wrote a dissent where he basically said, can't you people tell this was a joke? Bong Hits for Jesus, it's a piece of surreal street theater. He's not actually telling people to go out and break the law. It's just a joke that has some reference to breaking the law, and that should not be something that should be punishable. The majority, however, said, well, we aren't sure exactly what Bong Hits for Jesus means, but one of the things it might mean is I encourage you to break the marijuana laws and smoke marijuana, because that's one of the things it might mean it was okay for the school to punish Mr. Frederick for saying it. I obviously tend to think that Justice Stevens had the better of that argument, that there was a majority of votes the other way.
If you were dealing with adults, what would be the standard for someone who would be violating the law by promoting something? Is there a standard that the court uses?
Yes, in most situations, you have a constitutional right to encourage people to do things. And this includes actually encouraging people to break the law. I mean, if you think back to the civil rights movement, when we had segregated lunch counters in some parts of this country, there would be civil rights activists who were saying, all right, folks, this is a bad law. It needs to change. The way we're going to change it is we're going to have so many of us break this law until the prisons can't hold all of us anymore. And so that type of speech where you're actually encouraging, not only are you encouraging people to take political action, but you're even encouraging them to do something that might be illegal, in most circumstances you're allowed to do that very explicitly. If you're actually inciting people to violence in a way that is very direct, and so that within the next 5 minutes an assault is likely to happen. If I encourage you to pick up a brick and throw it at someone sitting right over there, and I'm really egging you on, that type of incitement could be punished by the police and the prosecutors. But in general, we have a great deal of freedom in this country to encourage people to do things, even if they're illegal.
So it looks like there's a very different standard applied to students and to adults, because a banner that's that says Bong Hits for Jesus is not really going to incite anyone to illegal action or violence immediately.
Right. There was a little bit of discussion in the court opinions, not very much, about this concept of incitement. The majority seemed to accept the idea that if you put up a banner that said Bong Hits for Jesus, more people would smoke more bongs, but they didn't really explain why that was so and why it is that students should be punished for that more than other people in other circumstances.
You know what I liked about your article, Aaron? Rather than just focusing on a specific case and the legal argument behind that case, you were able to really help the reader understand the vision of public education that animated those decisions. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit of that with our viewers.
Right. Well, there are a number of cases going back primarily to the 1940s about how students behave in public schools and what public schools are, what sort of control public schools are allowed to have over student behavior. And in almost all of those opinions, the justices will actually write a portion of the opinion that indicates, why the legal rule that they're creating makes sense in terms of the educational mission of the school. In 1940, there was an important case about Jehovah's Witness families who did not want their children to be saying the Pledge of Allegiance at school. According to their religion, you only pledge allegiance to God, and anything that's on the earthly plane is not something you take that sort of oath for. Well, the students were actually suspended from school because they wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. And this went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they upheld the punishment. And in doing so, they explained that the reason they were doing this is because the purpose of education is to instill common values. All right? If we don't have our schools teach students to love their country, the country's not going to be around for very long. And therefore, teaching, instilling patriotism and teaching students that here are certain things that we all agree on, that's what schools are all about. And if you start making exceptions so that some people don't stand up and say they agree with what everyone else says, then we're going to be in terrible shape. And that's why we can't allow any exceptions. So that was in 1940. Turned out to be not a very popular decision, actually. There were cases in lower courts after that where they refused to allow schools to punish students in that case. For instance, here in the state of Washington, there was a decision from the Washington Supreme Court where they said, no, not in this state. People have freedom of religion and they have freedom of speech. And besides, if the kid's only standing up and saying the Pledge of Allegiance because she doesn't want to be punished, I don't know that that's really demonstrating love of country anyway. So the Washington Supreme Court said, no, you can't punish in this situation. In 1943, there ended up being another case on a similar topic, and the U.S. Supreme Court reversed itself. And they said, no, everyone in our country has a right to freedom of conscience to decide what they believe, and the government can't force you to stand up and say you believe something if you don't. And in that opinion, they talked a lot about what a school is for and what education is about. And in this opinion, they took a very different view. They said the purpose of a school is, yes, it's to train people to be citizens, but what is a citizen? A citizen is someone who thinks critically, thinks individually, doesn't go along with the crowd, asks tough questions. And they talked about diversity of opinion. They talked about intellectual freedom. And they said that's what a school is for. We're not teaching people to be robots. We're teaching them to be free-thinking, independent actors. And that's the kind of education that will get us better citizens. So, of course, if that's what education is about, then making an exception for people like the Jehovah's Witnesses makes perfect sense.
Okay, thank you so much, Aaron. I'm going to turn now to our panel, and they have some questions from their own unique perspectives. So, John, do you want to begin?
I'm a sociologist, I guess, or an incurable one, I keep saying. And a couple of things struck me about your piece. Let me try to be absolutely brief in terms of historical view, which when I got to the section on Clarence Thomas, I went through the ceiling. It's so inaccurate, it's beyond me. But sort of a standard kind of observation, if we look, say, across the last 150 years of American schooling, is that the sort of unit of analysis, if you don't mind for the moment, has changed from local, it would be family-school exchange or relationship, to school-school, to now it really is school-state and school-nation. So the language of schooling is really to facilitate the interplay of macro units, schools. So when you refer to the Hazelwood case, and the issue is what voice, whose speech is this? What jumped out at me is what is the unit of analysis? Is it the school or is it the students? And they kind of vacillate between there. And I would see, I guess, that given that the unit of analysis is now really the school or school-state relationship, that has been a long-term kind of secular organizational trend that leaves it very ambiguous about what is a student and what is a student's speech. So that leads me to come back to your statement on the very first page, where you say that unlike the earlier decisions, the majority opinion in Morse is remarkably uninterested in the purpose of education. I know what you're saying, but just for the sake of a question, it strikes me, the opposite strikes me, is that it's profoundly a vision of American education, not one that I hold, but it really is the vision of the school-state, school-nation relationship. It's the vision. Morse seems to me to actually reflect the decline of the student and the hegemony, if you will, of the school-state relationship. And I sort of, even without reading the case, and I of course went to the case, I would suggest that it very much is a vision of schooling which doesn't even need the adjective conservative or anything like that. It is a vision, and it is a vision of protection and care and so forth. But it's also a vision, I would suggest, that has as its theory an epidemic theory of possible eventual behavior. So the time frame is dramatically shortened. It could be tomorrow that all students will show up with bongs, and that then is their evidence. So my question really to you is, do you see that it does reflect a vision of schooling?
Yeah, great question. I think you're right that there definitely was a vision of public education that was motivating the Supreme Court to reach the decision that it did in the Bong Hits for Jesus case. What was a little different than the earlier decisions is they didn't talk about it explicitly. In the first Pledge of Allegiance case that I mentioned, the court had spent several paragraphs explaining, here's why here's what schools are for, here's what the goal of this educational activity is. We think that's acceptable, we endorse that, and here's why the legal rule follows. In Morse, they really didn't talk about their vision. And maybe they would say, well, that's a good thing. Who cares about what our vision is? We're trying to stay in the background. In fact, since their vision affected the outcome of the case, I think it would have been better, or at least more intellectually transparent, if they had said more explicitly, here's our vision is that schools are places that teach students what the law is and that they have to obey it and that they're not allowed to say that breaking the law is a good thing. If they had at least said that out loud, we would know more where they were coming from and we could grapple with it and try to explain why that was a good thing or a bad thing. The way the majority opinion was written, as you say, it's pretty easy to figure out what they're thinking, but they don't actually say it.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a question, a slightly different angle, and not looking so much at the student and student speech rights, but broadening that in our vision of education to teacher and teacher speech rights for a number of reasons. If teachers are engaging students now back in the classroom and not in a field trip setting, but in the classroom, in curriculum and in topics where the issue has maybe some controversy to it or the students are going to be disagreeing, in essence, the teachers are facilitating students to engage in sharing some opinions that could be found to be offensive to some or controversial to others. And yet there are some recent cases that haven't quite made it to the Supreme Court. There's a case that was in the 7th District in 2007 of a case versus Mayer where she was limited on her teacher speech rights because it didn't fit into what the school had approved as far as the approved curriculum. So I go back to a question actually Lorena was asking earlier, talking about this idea that there are different standards for students than there are for adults. I would suggest that within the schools there are different standards for everybody participating there. And I wonder, as a preparer of teacher and teacher educators, the types of advice that we can gain from this ruling or from other Supreme Court rulings about what teachers need to be aware of and need to be thoughtful of as they are preparing curriculum that might take students into discussions of controversial issues or issues that the school may not agree with, but would still help the student to learn and think about an issue more deeply.
There certainly have been some cases that deal with the rights of teachers in terms of what freedom they have in structuring their curriculum and what they can say in the classroom. In general, when these questions have gotten to court, the answer is pretty much that what the principal says goes. The idea is, hey, we're hiring teachers in order to do a certain job. Let's say you're a science teacher. Your job is, or a biology teacher, your job is to teach the theory of evolution. Your job is not to profess your religious belief that the theory of evolution is all wrong. So the courts have pretty much said that it is the school board and then through the superintendent and the principal that decides what it is the teacher's job to say in the classroom. Now, in general, there is, in most schools, there's an ethic of more academic freedom. But if it ever gets to a point where it's going into court, there's not nearly as much of that as I think the general culture of teachers and administrators in the country supports. I mean, I think it's great for teachers to engage students on controversial topics. And one thing that was sort of interesting about Morse v. Frederick decision is some of the justices who agreed with the outcome, they were a little worried that it might be going too far and prevent students from having discussions about topics like the war on drugs. And so they wrote, so it was Justice Alito and Justice Kennedy wrote this separate opinion that says, okay, we agree that Bong Hits for Jesus banners can be punished, but we want to remind everyone that, you know, students can and should have open intellectual debates about the wisdom of our country's laws, but you need to do it in a way that doesn't look like you're advocating breaking the laws. It's more or less what they said. So I think the spirit of that opinion is something that a lot of teachers could probably implement in their classrooms when they're engaging students in this discussion.
I'd like to focus now on the principal, since I prepare principals and have been in the position of supervising them when situations like this might have come up. And it seems to me in this case, the principal's actions took a direction that, according to you said made matters worse. You didn't say that, but you indicated made matters worse because you said if the school had handled it differently, this might have not gone on to be a case. And in other language, the principal tore the banner from the student and then added more discipline to the student when he apparently talked back. So my interest is in how we can best prepare new principals to face these and other types of occurrences that they might run up against. We do teach a class in school law here in preparing principals, but it's mainly composed of cases like you wrote about and teaching them the details of that, and then the RCWs and related to suspension and expulsion rulings, and I think we do a good job on that. But I'm wondering if we can do a better job on helping new principals learn how to handle these matters. After all, you know, I'm envisioning this scenario, and it's on TV, a crowd is watching, you know, that some parents are going to complain no matter what you do, and the superintendent might get on your case. So you're in a very visible, highly potentially volatile role, and you have to act quickly. So, or maybe you don't, but that's my specific question. Do you have any advice that we can include for principals on how to act or not to act when they face a situation like this so they're not overreacting or underreacting? What could we advise them to do when there's a case that might have some First Amendment?
That last little bit, we got messed up.
Oh, boy. Well, let me see. I'll start with my specific question, you think, that
would
part?
be good.
Okay. All right. So my specific question is if you have some advice for principals on how to handle these cases, which actions they can take or not take so as not to overreact or underreact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you've taken on a tough job for yourself, which is how to teach people how to have good judgment in every situation. And obviously every day you go to school, something slightly different is happening, and it ultimately does boil down to good judgment. I would maybe suggest two things for young school principals to keep in mind. One would be is to think about, is the student's behavior really causing a problem for teachers and other students, or is it just something that I find aggravating and unseemly? And, you know, Lord knows in a junior high school or a high school there will be students who are trying to push the principal's buttons. And that's not mature behavior. It doesn't deserve to be rewarded. But when a principal is thinking about, is this a situation where I need to act, you know, I think the touchstone really is not, you know, try to step back from the situation, think less about how am I feeling, but hey, is this behavior something that's really causing a problem for other people? If it's not, then maybe discipline isn't required. I certainly think that in this particular situation, where from what was described in the court papers, holding up this banner really didn't cause any big problem. Students were throwing snowballs at each other, and there were bottles being thrown around, and there was a lot of hubbub and activity on the street, and the fact that some students were holding up a funny, goofy banner didn't really change the tenor of the event. So it would have been possible for another school principal to have decided, this is not something where I need to intervene. But obviously, it's a judgment call on all of them. A second thing that might help some principals is to remember that they are the government. Mm-hmm. I mean, they certainly are. When they go to court, they're portrayed as the government. But because educators, don't usually go into education in order to be a police officer. You care about education, you want to facilitate growth, and so on, and you're not accustomed to thinking of yourself as the enforcer, although there are some people who have to take on that role because every school needs it. But sometimes people can forget, sometimes adults can forget how powerful they are compared to the students. I think most school principals think of themselves as, they're nice people with families and so on. But to a student, you're the chief of police and the judge and the mayor and the keeper of the jail all rolled into one. And so sometimes for students, an interaction with the principal might feel more like when you're pulled over on the side of the road by the sheriff. And so just to remember that, hey, I may have more power in this situation than I realize, and I may be presenting more of an intimidating face than I realize. That may help guide people towards the right place to balance that.
Thank you.
I'd like to join John in congratulating Aaron for this very lucid article that focuses on something that, for me, is of supreme importance. I think everything that the Supreme Court does teaches, and everything that teachers do teaches, and everything that principals do teaches. And so when this principal says, I'm doubling the punishment because you talk back, to me that is the worst conceivable lesson she could have taught this young man. And I'm glad she got sued. I guess my question to Aaron is this, that throughout this article, it's luminous what the value of the author really is. The value of the author is looking for those points in the decision where there is some support. And you do this marvelously in law journal style. You maintain this feeling of neutrality about the article. But it's clear that what you favor is some kind of view of education in which the student's ability to learn about democracy, to strive to learn things by understanding them, which means engaging in some kind of discursive contact with somebody about the subject matter, not simply engaging and not being a victim of what I call the information theory of learning, having it offloaded onto you, and having to regurgitate it back in such a way that you may well understand it, but no one encourages you to behave in a way that demonstrates that understanding. So I guess what I would ask you, having studied these cases so thoroughly, is do you think it's possible for the court to genuinely teach another lesson? Suppose these decisions were quite luminously in favor of the Caplan position. Would that make any difference, except in terms of the way the law is enforced?
One thing that I've noticed as I've been reading Supreme Court opinions that deal with the rights of students is that at a lot of the time they are written in language that seems to be speaking more to the public at large than in other kinds of cases. For example, there may be antitrust cases where the court is talking about, the way certain economic models operate and things like that. And in those cases, they aren't trying very hard to communicate with the ordinary citizen. It'll have a lot of technical language in it, and they will not be taking pains to try to break things down for a way that a general audience would understand. It seems like in some of the school cases, the court is almost consciously writing to a larger public. The Tinker case, which was about the armbands during the Vietnam War, definitely has some language in it that is, I think, really designed to resonate not just with lawyers, but to the public at large. It's one of my favorite quotes from Tinker, where he says, the First Amendment is supposed to do more than just create a safe haven for crackpots. It's like, okay, you wouldn't have a sentence like that if you weren't trying to reach a broader audience. Nowadays, with the way the media works, I think the justices, if they wanted to, could do even more of that. I think that they may know that a case like this one, where there's going to be a lot of press interest because everyone has been to high school, or almost everyone, and that they can relate to the facts and they'll be curious about what the outcome is. And so there is teaching value beyond just the legal profession in these opinions. Now, of course, if the justices don't want to teach to a general audience, they can make these opinions dry and technical if they want to. But I think oftentimes something about the fact that one of the litigants in the case is a high school student, it encourages them to write in more ordinary language, and so I think there are definitely teaching opportunities. Whether the Supreme Court is going to take them and whether they're going to teach the lessons that I'm hoping is a whole other question.
Just out of curiosity, you were a clerk earlier in your career. When you were working on opinions for your judge, did issues of audience of this kind ever come up for you?
I think I think they did a couple of times. What often happens in the Court of Appeals is there are just so many more cases. You need to get them decided and get them out the door. But I do remember a couple of cases where we knew it was something that was newsworthy, that it would be reported on, and so we wanted to make sure that opinion was extra careful.
As a future educator, I'm concerned with what I see as an intense and rigid authoritarianism increasingly permeating education these days. And I feel like the case, as well as your articles, was evidence of this. I was wondering if you could discuss what you think some of the driving forces behind this might be, and more importantly, how it can be combated by teachers.
I'm not sure what the source of the authoritarianism is that you've identified. I think, particularly in the Morse v. Frederick case, which involved speech about drugs, there has been a lot of movement in society in general, and particularly in politics, to try to capitalize on this whole war on drugs mentality. Politicians, and this goes back all the way to the 30s, when it was first decided that marijuana was going to be prohibited, that there was political hay to be made by being tough on drugs. And this has continued up to the present time. In the 80s, we had lots of new laws drastically increasing the number of people who were convicted of drug crimes and lengthening their sentences. And it's one of the reasons why it's harder to get funding for education, is because we are spending so much money putting people in prison. Now, does that necessarily translate into what's happening in school? Probably not directly, but there has certainly been, with regard to speech about drugs, there's some larger societal forces that are encouraging a certain way to look at it, and then the schools in turn get their marching orders that, hey, your job as part of this bigger societal thing is to be rigid. I'm sure it can be changed. It's going to take a lot of work by a lot of people. It's great to know that there are people entering the professions who feel the way that you do, because you'll have a nice long career where maybe you can move the pendulum back to a place that is a little less rigid and a little more cultivating a little more independent thought amongst your students. But obviously these are things that get fought out every day in different schools around the country, and also get fought out at higher levels like school boards, and Congress has its impact as well, and certainly the media has a lot to do with it. So there are a lot of different roles for people who want to change the tenor of the process.
Well, as I previously mentioned, I'm going to teach French to high school students, but I'm more concerned about how I can really help the students succeed after high school, basically. And I don't think maybe learning French is what's going to help them succeed the most. So, and as a student, I've often felt like I haven't had a lot of teacher support when it comes to things like rights, because they're just there to, they're the enforcers of the law also. So what can teachers do to help enforce the rights that students have, free speech rights and other constitutional rights?
Yeah. Well, two things leap to my mind on that. One is sort of to do what Professor Larson was talking about and make that part of your curriculum. And you could even do that as a foreign language teacher. Obviously you need to be talking about something in this foreign language, and if you wanted to, in a French class, you could be talking about the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and how did the American the philosophy behind the American Revolution was picked up and used by people in the French Revolution as well. So there are certainly opportunities for you to work that into your curriculum if that's something that's important to you. Then a second mechanism that anyone can do regardless of curriculum is, again, to have a sense of perspective about what your students are doing. Similar to what we were talking about with Professor Darrington, if the teacher is the witness to a lot of student conduct, you're there in the class, you see what the kids are doing. If you want to, you can have a hair trigger for that and say, okay, if these kids step out of line, I'm sending them to the principal's office right now. Or you can take more of an approach like, hey, I'm only going to reserve the disciplinary approach for things that are really causing a problem for my classroom. And so by, in a lot of ways, the teacher is sort of the first gatekeeper into the disciplinary system. So if the teacher says, all right, I am not going to send this student to the principal's office, and if the principal then says, and I'm not going to send this person to the sheriff, and so on, everybody can be a gatekeeper along the way. And if you make sure that, as a classroom teacher, you have some perspective about, okay, what's truly causing a problem in the classroom versus what's aggravating, and reserve the discipline for the real problems rather than the aggravations, or rather the things that just insult your own ego, that's another way to get people accustomed to a little more freedom in expressing themselves.
Before I ask you a final question, Aaron, I wanted to just ask our co-interviewers if you have any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask at this time.
I'm curious about the stretch or reach of Tinker, of why Tinker wouldn't invalidate the claims of violation of rights.
Right. Well, it does go in some ways the question of why did the Supreme Court even
Yeah.
take this case. We were sort of hoping they wouldn't. But there was another case that happened in between these two. The Tinker case in 1969 said, hey, students get to speak unless they're causing a disruption. In the mid-'80s, there was another case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was actually out of the state of Washington. It was called Bethel School District versus Fraser. Mm-hmm. And what happened in that one is the student was giving a nominating speech for senior class officers. And he was nominating his friend to be vice president. And he gave a kind of off-color speech. It was at a school assembly. And he didn't use any four-letter words, but it was a lot of double entendres and things like that. And he was punished for misusing the school assembly. And that ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was sort of the opinion that was written in 1986 was sort of hard to determine which of two theories they were operating on. One theory would be, well, hey, this student did something disruptive, so it's just a Tinker type of case. You know, this was supposed to be an assembly about student elections, and instead he was turning it into an off-color nightclub act. That's disruptive. The audience was put off, and that's why he's being punished. So there was some language in the opinion that sort of went that way. There was other language in the opinion that just sort of said, no, we aren't really concerned about whether there was disruption. We just think that this was misbehavior, and the school should be able to punish misbehavior. This is not the way we behave when we're given the microphone and talking to a captive audience. So for many years after this 1986 decision, there have been scholarly articles within the legal profession and some lower court opinions saying, well, gee, was this 1986 case saying that that Tinker was the only standard, or was it that there were two? And one of the things that came out of the Morse v. Frederick case, sort of on the legal side, is they made it very explicit. They said, disruptive speech is something you can punish, and there are other things you can punish, and the one we're talking about today is speech that is advocating drug use. So in a lot of ways, this new decision in the Bong Hits case could open up a whole lot of other things that schools could start punishing students for. And as a free speech advocate, that worries me.
Especially with that word advocacy in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not supposed to be advocating things.
Right.
Is that happening? Because it's been about a year, right?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any new court cases where courts have taken up this suggestion and started finding new bases for punishing students, but it certainly could happen.
Yeah. Bethel and Hazelwood was just a couple years apart.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Hazelwood case was about the ability of school administrators to control what's in the student newspaper.
Right.
And in that one, the Supreme Court said, hey, it's the school's newspaper, not the student's newspaper. If a school wants to, it can declare that the school newspaper is for the students. And some schools do that.
Again, for me, the principle there is, what are you teaching?
Mm-hmm.
Are you teaching that you can print anything as long as I like it? Or are you teaching journalism,
Right.
in which you're digging for stories and trying to tell the truth about things?
Yeah, each of these decisions about maintaining order also teach something.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I have one final question. One of the things that our journal is looking at are the tensions that one finds in public school policies that are deeply rooted in our political philosophy, the philosophy of a a liberal democratic society. And while we seek to promote values like liberty, we're also often trying to promote values like equality. And those values sometimes come into conflict. For example, in our very first issue, we considered the court decision in Sachs versus State College Area School District, where the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against a school district's anti-harassment policy and found it to be a violation of the First Amendment. In that particular case, it was because the policy was too vague. But I was wondering, are there any guidelines for schools and principals and teachers who want to respect the speech rights of students, but also want to create a safe, secure, nurturing environment in order to achieve equal educational opportunities for everyone? Could you share perhaps with our viewers what guidelines we might think about?
Right. Well, the topic that you raise about student harassment is an important one, and it's a difficult one, I think, for schools and teachers. Obviously, harassment is a really pernicious thing. If students are bullied or have their educational experience be so hostile that they just can't get an education, that is obviously a big problem. What's difficult in a lot of cases is identifying what is harassment that we want to remove from the school and what is speech that we just don't happen to like. And there have been some cases where a student might express an idea that is controversial and might be viewed by a lot of people as unwelcome, but it is not actually harassing in the sense of targeting a particular student. So, for example, there was a recent case out of California where a student wore a T-shirt expressing his viewpoint that homosexuality is sinful. Now, that school had a policy that students should not harass each other on the basis of sexual orientation, and that's a good policy. I don't want there to be harassment on the basis of sexual orientation. But is merely wearing a T-shirt that expresses his idea automatically a form of harassment? I think it is not. And what we need to do is try to come up with a good definition of what harassment is. And that's tough because it takes a million different forms. I think part of the definition needs to be that it is conduct that is aimed at a particular person. If I'm just a student who has vulgar or obnoxious ideas, that's not aimed at making a particular person uncomfortable. So the student with obnoxious ideas, you try to talk to them, you try to inculcate better ideas, but you don't punish that person as a harasser. However, if the student is then, being a bully, stealing somebody's lunch money, vandalizing their property, calling them names, when it gets to be that sort of directed conduct, then I think it's entirely appropriate for a school to take action. But it is, I'm not going to pretend that it's easy to tell the difference. There will often be conduct that you could make arguments either way.
Do you think wearing certain symbols like a symbol of the swastika or a symbol of the noose, would that itself constitute harassment?
The courts have said that in terms of symbols that could have racially derogatory overtones like a swastika or a Confederate flag, that it sort of depends on what the history has been at that school. If it is a school where there's been lots of racial tension and bringing these symbols in is likely to result in there being fights or disruptions or increasing racial tension, then a school could say, we're not going to allow that symbol in. If you don't have that history, students sometimes will try to wear symbols just to test the waters and see how outrageous they can be. Like Sid Vicious, when he was in the Sex Pistols, he wore a shirt with a swastika on it. And it wasn't because he was a Nazi, it was because it was a controversial symbol and he just wanted to be controversial. So my own view is just wearing the symbol by itself is not harassment, but in certain situations it could be very disruptive. And always, if a student is coming in wearing a swastika or waving a noose around, you can always have a talk with that student and say, do you understand how this feels to members of minority groups and so on? There are lots of things that schools can do that don't involve punishment and depriving someone of an education. It's always going to be appropriate to talk to students and say, don't you realize why this is a bad idea?
That's a very interesting point to end at, I think, because sometimes when we talk about student rights, we're always talking about legal questions and litigation, and we forget that really the school's role, the function of the school, is to educate. And what we ought to do is, be focusing on how are we educating our students about these issues. Well, Aaron, I'd like to thank you so much for being our first guest on our new series called Talking with the Authors. And I'd like to thank our panel for the excellent questions that you raised. And I would also like to invite our viewers to take a look at the actual article that Aaron wrote. It's called Visions of Public Education in Morse v. Frederick, and you can find it in the Journal of Educational Controversy online. It's our winter 2008 issue, Volume 3, Number 1. And for those who don't know how to get to the journal, just go to the Western Washington University website and you can find the Journal of Educational Controversy from there. Thank you again, Aaron.
Thank you very much.